Good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me well with this microphone? Okay, thank you. I'm not great with microphones. Thank you for your presentation. This was very insightful. I'm going to talk about other issues related to the intermediate climate target. And I'm Vivien Köböl-Benda. I'm here with two hats. I have also an academic background. My research area mostly covers environmental, human rights issues, especially the right to a healthy environment. And I also work for a Hungarian think tank for the Institute for Energy Strategy. And I work mostly with green policy issues, so biodiversity and climate change connection and human rights too. So my main points will not be a surprise in this slide, because I'm going to talk about the biodiversity and equality and human rights issues related to the target. At the starting point, it is a legal duty for the states to act against the climate change, and it was acknowledged and stressed by the International Court of Justice this summer in the recent advisory opinion. According to the court, the states have multiple obligations under international law to act with precaution and have a due diligence obligation to reduce GHG emissions. So at the first place, reducing GHG emissions is a must. And from the human rights perspective, what we learned from the Klimaseniorin contra Switzerland case, the European Court of Human Rights emphasized that the states must make immediate actions, effective measures, and also set intermediate targets. So when the EU is going to set an intermediate target, it is desirable. But I think the main question, how will this target designed? Because not only the what is the goal is important, but how we reach this goal. So my first aspect in this relation is the emission reduction versus removals. The EU's 2050 target is a so-called net zero target, which means it can be reached by GHG reduction, and it can be reached with carbon storage, as it was mentioned before, and with carbon removal. The problem is that there is no prioritizing which should used mostly. From the perspective of biodiversity, removals can only complement this, the emission, not replace the emission reduction targets. And of course, nature-based removals should be prioritized. The proposal of the European Commission has no prioritizing related to nature-based or artificial removals. There is a recent study that concluded that nature-based removals like afforestation, wetland restoration, rewetting is way more effective than artificial removals. So a prioritization, a hierarchy is needed in the proposal in this aspect. And the second point, which is related to the first point, that biodiversity and climate protection must go hand in hand in a holistic manner. We have a legally binding target under the EU Nature Restoration Law. We should restore 30% of the degraded habitats by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 90% by 2050. And there is a legally not binding but strategically important commitment under international law, under the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And the EU and all the member states made a global commitment to restore the degraded ecosystems by 2050, and with an intermediate target by 2030, which is 30%, 30 by 30. So we have strong international and European commitments regarding to biodiversity protection. And unfortunately, the proposal of the Commission is a little bit restricted about biodiversity protection, and the proposal was based on the report of the Scientific Board on Climate Change, and this report is also not considering biodiversity in a very wide manner. And there is a very significant risk in the proposal related to the biodiversity protection, because up to 3% of emission cuts may be met through international carbon credits. And this raises a very serious concern, human rights issues and biodiversity issues. These carbon credits are non-EU carbon credits, and there is no universal international methodology to verify carbon credits. There are voluntary and mandatory mechanisms around the world. For example, the European ETS system is a mandatory. It can be familiar to everyone, but a lot of countries don't have this system, so the verification is a little bit a slippery slope, because a lot of studies and investigation revealed that serious human rights issues arises related to the carbon credits, for example, land grabbing of indigenous people and local communities, especially in the Latin American region. And sometimes very extreme cases are present, because last year Ricardo Stoppe was arrested in Brazil, and he was a leader of a gang which used carbon credits as a hiding activity. So the carbon credits and the profit from carbon credits was used to hide and to fund an illegal logging activity in Brazil. So it was a so-called operation greenwashing. So sometimes the verification procedure and the follow-up of this credit is not sufficient. These credits are mostly verified by a United States-based association called VERA, which is not a state authority. So it is not too transparent how these credits are verified, and there is no effective follow-up how this credit can contribute to climate protection. There are also recent studies that most of the credits is very high percentage, 90% of the carbon credits are so-called phantom credits, which means they have no use for climate protection. So this 3% in the Commission proposal is very concerning. And I think the goal should be reached domestically and regionally. And of course, it is important to help developing countries to meet their climate and biodiversity goals, but there is too many dangers with this 3%, so this should be under negotiation. So climate targets should not jeopardize biodiversity protection, because we have very strong commitments to meet by 2030 under the biodiversity regime too. And without protecting and restoring nature, we can reach the climate targets. And it's a bit underrepresented in the Commission's proposal. It is also linked to the third point of my presentation, which is greenwashing and creditability. You can see carbon credits can serve greenwashing purposes, and in the EU there was negotiation about the so-called Green Claims Directive, but the trilogue ended, and right now we have no legally binding act against climate and environmental greenwashing, which is very important in the light of the intermediate and long-term climate targets, because sometimes GHG emission can be presented as something very beneficial for the environment, but sometimes it is actually against biodiversity. For example, solar panels can be placed sometimes in protected area, or plants can be used for biomass that are not indigenous in the place where it is planted. So biodiversity protection and greenwashing protection is also a very important point in this slide. And it is also connected to policy coherence and alignment, because other sectors are concerned, not only biodiversity, but agriculture. And the land use and forestry goals should be also aligned. And agriculture is connected to the health of European citizens. And there is a recent EU study that if we change our dietary habits, that could significantly contribute to meet the climate goals. So other strategies, for example, the farm-to-fork strategy, should also be considered during the implementation of the target related to climate change. And last but not least, the equality issues and human rights dimension of the target. As the colleagues had presented, the transition technologies are quite mature in Europe, but according to the experts, social, human rights, economic and political risks are remaining related to the intermediate target. For example, there was a revision of the European trading scheme. There, in 2027, the ETS2 will under operationalization, and while the ETS1 was covering power and industry, the ETS2 will cover fossil fuels using for building, heating, and transport. And that means the household and the European citizens will directly feel its impact, so it should be balanced. Of course, climate mitigation is very important, but climate adaptation is also important, and adaptation can work without equality and protection of human rights and protection of vulnerable communities. And there is a so-called social climate fund, and from this fund, the 37% of the revenue can be used to support lower income families in this transition, but it should be considered to be use a higher percent of revenue, because maybe this would not be enough. And of course, climate change leads to inequalities itself, so climate transition shouldn't strengthen these inequalities too. So the policies must ensure the just transition and prevent energy poverty and respect human rights and equality. To concluding, the climate target, the intermediate climate target is a need. GHG reduction is a need. We should meet this. The EU should meet this under the UNFCCC, and of course we have other goals that we should achieve under the CBD and other environmental obligations. So the main question, how we reach this goal and how we design this goal. One of the biggest danger is, I think, this carbon credit issue, but also the equality issue. So this should be tackled during the negotiations. And as a closing remark, there is a very, very successful international agreement under international environmental law, which is the Montreal Protocol on the ozone-depleting substances. And there is a similarity between the Paris Agreement and the Montreal Protocol, because the Montreal Protocol also aims to reduce certain substances, just like the Paris Agreement, but there is a big difference. The Montreal Protocol is very progressive and considers in practice the interest of developing countries, while the Paris Agreement is a bit not too strong in this light. So maybe this should be a model for the European Union too, how GHG reduction should be done. I had this point as a discussion point, so I'm really happy if you give your opinion or feedback. I don't know, we have not too much time, but maybe in the coffee break, I would be happy if you hear your your feedback about this human rights and biodiversity issue. So thank you so much.